see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Radhika Balakrishnan from Rutgers University, and I'm here to welcome you to a panel entitled Feminist Perspectives on Inequality, Crisis, and Macroeconomic Policy, hosted by the International Association for Feminist Economics. The first panelist will be myself, and I will be talking about how human rights can help in understanding the link between economic policy and well-being. I will introduce each of the panelists as their turn comes up. And so the first person to speak is going to be me. Okay, and can you all see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Okay, not yet.
Now.
Ah, thank you. Thank you. So as I said, my talk today actually started out as something different than what it is, and I'll explain to you how I got to where I am now. I started out trying to look at the movement around the world to look at well-being rather than GDP as a way to evaluate the economy, and started looking at different indicators of well-being. We've been working recently with New Zealand to look at the way in which they're describing well-being, and so I thought the work that I've been doing and with others on human rights could really define how to look at well-being. So next slide, or I can do it. James, I think you have to do it. Did it change? Okay, great. So to start with, is GDP a useful measure of the economy? It increases GDP, economic growth. GDP can be a useful measure, but GDP does not include a lot of things that affect our economy. I don't think I need to go over all of this, but it's not necessarily the best way to evaluate how the economy is doing. And worldwide, there's a move towards looking at something else other than GDP. The next. So some of the missing factors in GDP that contribute to well-being that are excluded from GDP are health, life expectancy, education, and a clean and sustainable environment. And I want to highlight that because that's the part I'm going to come back to talk about how we look at economy in terms of the environment. The value of leisure time, unpaid care work, and problems that arise from inequality. So well-being as an alternative criterion to evaluate the economy is being used around the world. The Human Development Index in the 70s was the early attempt to sort of decenter GDP as the only way to judge an economy. Which, and the Human Development Index was a composite of life expectancy, education, per capita income to rank countries, as well as many other indicators over time that have been used. So it's not really to go through that. And the OECD has developed a series of well-being indicators. So if we can go to that. So this is from the OECD's current well-being indicators. It looks at income, wealth, work, job quality, housing, health, knowledge and skills, subjective well-being, which there's quite a bit of literature on this. And this is not my attempt to try and go through all of this, but to look at how human rights might be able to sort of concretize some of this: safety, work-life balance, social connections, and civic engagements. And the resources for this current well-being is natural capital, economic capital, human capital, and social capital. And for those of you who are interested, there's a ton of literature in OECD on how to measure well-being and by different countries. And so for a while, I started looking at specific countries. Scotland has some of the more interesting kind of feminist perspectives on well-being. And then I ended up looking very much at the issue of environmental quality. So the next slide. So looking at the radical potential of human rights, as I said, this was sort of my early attempt to do this paper, was really saying, can the human rights framework concretize some of these things that are being used in well-being, because it's not quite there. So what if the economy was to fulfill human rights? What does this change? Then economies become grounded in substantive freedoms and that are written in international law. And as a feminist, looking at non-discrimination and equality as a premise of well-being would give it a concreteness that it doesn't have. And also, you know, CEDAW and other human rights instruments look at substantive equality, which is the equality of outcome rather than opportunity, which is what a lot of people look at in terms of equality, in terms of the feminist economics work on care economy, the right to leisure, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to housing, education. And the last is accountability, transparency, and participation, which is a really important part of the human rights framework, will hopefully give us a more democratic economy. And the human rights framework also puts the state in as a duty bearer to fulfill all these rights. So there's some very concrete things that come out of the human rights framework that I wanted to use to look at the well-being indicators. So the next. But the question that kept coming up to me was, you know, the human rights framework and the well-being indicators are good in that they focus on people and outcomes as individuals at the household level, and it looks at inequality, and it can also look at deprivation. GDP fails to look at sustainability. Economic growth, is it sustainable over time? I think most of us, in terms of looking at issues of inequality, we still rely on economic growth as the answer to you know, dealing with issues of inequality. And how do we look at sustainability in a long-term way? So the OECD has now come up with Beyond Growth towards a new economic approach to look at it. It's a very interesting document that is trying to kind of really problematize the kind of macroeconomic policies that rely on growth. And how do we go beyond it? What are the larger issues that we need to tackle? And basically this document, Beyond Growth, says that they don't quite have the answers, but it's a really important question. How do we look at macroeconomic policy beyond economic growth, and what is the kind of new analysis that we need to get there? So the next one. So then as I was looking through all these well-being indicators, I started reading about buen vivir. Buen vivir is it's a good life, right? Is the literal translation, but it comes from indigenous tradition that is beyond human life. It's sort of looking at a good life as a society. And Ecuador is part of coming up with these well-being indicators in buen vivir. And I also found very interesting that a few countries have been trying to put this concept of buen vivir into their constitutions. And so how do you actually implement buen vivir when it's in your constitutions? And what does it mean? And how does it, and it was very interesting to look at the ways in which human rights were kind of woven into the buen vivir idea, and at the same time went beyond the human rights frame. To look at the rights of nature and a good life, not necessarily just of the economy. The next one. So buen vivir has the right to a good life, includes nutrition, health, education, water, very reminiscent of economic social rights, basic thing, but it goes beyond that. And it's kind of critiquing the development model in a way that I don't think the well-being indicators and that analysis does. And it really is about kind of bringing up a decolonial model of an economy that is being developed. And also the relationship to nature, harmony with nature, and the exploitation of natural resources. There's a great long critique of how Buen Vivir was attempted and not really succeeded in Ecuador. So I'm not sort of arguing that this is the end all, but I think it brings up important issues for us to think about as we move forward. The next one. So in Bolivia, for example, it has 10 key elements for Buen Vivir, and one is to eradicate the capitalist model. So that itself is a huge ask, and to denounce wars, respect for Mother Earth, and then it keeps coming back to some of the basic services that human rights has, which is water, education, health, communications, and as an obligation of the state. So I think there's something to promote within that, and to live in harmony with Earth and not living at the expense of each other. So I think those are also important criterion for us to think about as we develop this kind of more holistic model. The next one. Coming back to feminist economics idea, there's a harmonious balance between nature and conditions of life and other forms of life. The same way in which feminist economics has brought care and reproduction, the idea of a perspective of care, Buen Vivir is trying to look at that in terms of the environment. Feminists from that region have brought a really important critique of Buen Vivir, because it also in some ways seems like it's going to gender roles that are indigenous roles that might not be that great in terms of women's rights. And so there's a critique of the use of rights within the feminist critique of Buen Vivir, but also there's the use of rights within it. So how to incorporate rights into the Buen Vivir paradigm that is feminist is kind of my struggle, and I'm putting this out there as more a thing that I haven't solved than something that I would love to have a conversation. Last one, I think. Yeah, so the last slide is, IPEC in Karachi has done all this work on the purple economy, which is looking at sort of the care economy and the environment and the green movement. And so I thought that might be a place to kind of bring these ideas together. Most of the work that I read from there was really to how to internalize the costs of care as well as the environment into economic well-being. I think the purple economy is a start to look at that relationship between kind of feminist concerns on care, unpaid care work, the linkages between caring for human beings and caring for the environment. The challenge to me now is, how do we look at an alternative to the current unsustainable model of the world? I mean, climate change is obviously, I don't think anyone needs to make a case, is affecting everyone's well-being, including that of nature. So how do we then, look at macroeconomics beyond something that is reliant on growth, but how do we take the kind of caring economy and the care work that we've done in terms of human reproduction that actually looks at caring for the people and the planet that we live in? So, so as I said, I started out with a very clear idea of how I was going to analyze well-being based on human rights, and then Ecuador jumped in, and I ended up going through a very long reading of issues on Buen Vivir, and I have to say a lot of it's in Spanish, and my Spanish is not good enough to read all the translations. So I was able to read some of it, and maybe Corina, one of these days, you and I can have a conversation about some of the critique. But I just think as feminist economists working on issues of macroeconomic policy and inequality, we need to take into account this body of work that's coming out of Latin America, and I don't think is given enough visibility, and connected to the OECD movement for looking at well-being as an alternative to growth as the economic policy making. I will end there. Okay, our next panel is Darrick Hamilton, who is at the New School for Social Research in New York City. And the topic of Darrick's presentation is the inseparable intersection of race, gender, family, and economic circumstance. Darrick, you're on.
Thank you. I wonder, can everyone see the presentation?
Yep.
Good. So I'm going to try to go quick and do a whole lot in a little bit of time. But as was mentioned, the talk is the inseparable intersections of race, gender, family, and economic circumstance. Many may recall the New York Times presentation of Raj Chetty and his colleagues' study, which demonstrated the relationship between intergenerational class position across race. And this was the famous upshot video that if it was animated, you'd see how Blacks and white men were sorted from beginning in a wealthy family. In a affluent family, it shows that basically whites were much more likely to end up in an affluent household, end up affluent white men growing up in a household that was affluent compared to black boys when they became an adult. And then here's another graphic demonstrating that result, where you can see along the horizontal axis the income rank of parents, and then you can see along the vertical axis the income rank of the kids of those parents. And here it is by race. You can see that white men, if you look at that yellow line, were more likely to end up with more affluence compared to Black men. But aha, the result did not hold when you compared Black women to white women, and hits the point of what I'm going to present. Is that the right comparison? Two things to note before I get into the talk. Well, this is an op-ed that shows some of the work. This is expanding on an op-ed that Jen and I did. And then if we were to look at other outcomes like health, for example, we can see that even when Black women acquire college degrees, their infant mortality rates, the likelihood of having a healthy infant, is greater than that of a white woman who dropped out of high school. And that the disparities in infant mortality across race don't subside with education, but rather increase. So class and other indicators, even if we don't look at income, is not the same across race. And then if we look at wealth, of course, you see that no matter how you cut the data, educated, not educated, married, not married, Black women have much lower levels of wealth than white women. In fact, when a Black woman who is in a white woman in a single household has more wealth than a Black woman in a married household with two earners. All right, so let me stop sharing and try to present some accounts. All right, so the media accounts of that groundbreaking study by Chetty et al. Links millions of IRS tax records with census data across race, gender, and generations. It focuses on a finding where it says, quote, Black boys raised in America, even in the wealthiest families and living in some of the most well-to-do neighborhoods, still earn less in adulthood than white boys with similar backgrounds. Now, I should note that they don't actually control for wealth. They have an indicator of home ownership and other socioeconomic indicators, but using the census data, they don't actually have net wealth. That's an important distinction. According to Chetty and his co-authors, Black men confront challenges unique to them, which result in lower income, lower unemployment rates, lower high school completion rates, and higher incarceration rates. But the story emphasized that the findings do not hold for girls and women. When compared to white girls, Black girls with similarly affluent families and neighborhoods attain similar incomes as white girls when they both reach adulthood, leading the author to conclude that, quote, there are a unique set of challenges for Black men. We do not dispute that Black men have a set of individual outcomes that differ from that of both whites and Black women. However, Black men do not experience challenges alone. Black men and women are not so neatly separable from each other due to intergenerational as well as household level effects that don't allow them to be so neatly separated. This reality renders a comparison of Black women to white women in terms of individual incomes as incomplete at best and misleading overall. We do not live in a vacuum that neatly separates women from men. The simple comparison of Black women's wages to white women's wages does not disentangle the impact of race from gender when examining economic outcomes and lived experience. Other important context and nuance should be considered. For example, if we look at Becky Pettit's work in her book, Invisible Men, it emphasizes that labor market studies exclude incarcerated individuals who are grossly disproportionately Black men. Black men make up about 6% of the US population, but roughly 50% of the population in American prisons. And there's about a 1 in 3 likelihood that a Black man will end up incarcerated at some point in his life. That obviously has spillover effects on Black families. The negative spillover and intersectional effects of mass incarceration of Black men is the fact that rather than being a source of resource for households, Black men in prison further drain household budgets that also impact Black women. Compounding the situation, there's also a share of incarcerated there's a growing share of Black women that are being incarcerated relative to white women. In our patriarchy society, it's unreasonable to separate women, Black men, Black and white women from their larger familial and social context. The structural racism identified in the Chetty study vividly illustrates that even with an affluent class background, Black men have much lower employment rates, lower incomes, and 10 times more likely to be incarcerated. The precarious economic position of Black men, combined with a rigid interracial marriage market in which Black women are the least likely demographic to intermarry, results in a pool of eligible males, eligible meaning having both not being incarcerated, but literally being available, as well as having resources, is dramatically smaller with far fewer economic resources than their white counterparts. The outcome is Black women tend to face greater familial, financial, and caregiving responsibilities than their white women counterpart, even when you control for family background. An extreme, but perhaps not far-fetched example to drive home this point might be a working white mom whose spouse has a high-earning managerial job in contrast to a working Black mom whose spouse has been incarcerated. The tragic reality is that the double stigma of being formally incarcerated and Black effectively renders Black men unemployable in the formal sector with decent pay. The intertwined nature of women's and men's lives mean that so-called, quote, unique challenges faced by Black men no longer seem so unique. Focusing on individuals and not family income does not acknowledge the social reality in which Black women and men live. Moreover, wealth is a better indicator than income altogether, and it is the paramount economic well-being and financial indicator of agency in one's life. Wealth becomes an input in all sorts of other endeavors in which we live. Black women with and without children, married or single, and with or without a college degree tend to have dramatically less wealth than comparable white women. In fact, Black women with a college degree typically have less wealth than white women with no degree. And this result holds regardless of whether we compare married or single women. Further, this disparity widens with age. College-educated single Black women 60 years or older typically have only $11,000 in wealth, which is less than 3 cents for every dollar held by a comparable age college-educated single white woman whose median in wealth is about $384,000. That's a wealth gap in excess of $350,000, which certainly is not indicative of racial parity among women. The challenge that Black men and women confront together suggests that Black women tend to have the greater familial, financial, caregiving responsibilities than their white women counterpart at all levels of income, further Black women's effort to sustain their families and communities in a racist patriarchy, heteronormative society may have dire consequences on Black women's health, as was demonstrated in the graph that I showed you. So if we think about policy, let me pause. I don't know how much time I have. Let me see. Do I have time to talk about policy?
You got 5 minutes.
I got 5 minutes, good. Well, I'm gonna give a shout out to a colleague, Diane Stewart, in her book entitled Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African-American Marriage, where Diane talks about historical and contemporary racism and resource deprivation and its impact on love itself. So love is treated as the, it flips the general narrative that as a result of household structures, Black families have worse outcomes than white families, and actually says that it is resource itself that leads to household structure. So she makes the case clearly and vividly that what is at issue is resource deprivation and racism itself. And then she also cites baby bonds as a mechanism, as a policy tool to address some of the intergenerational as well as racial sorting and gender sorting that comes along with an endowment of wealth itself that is very intergenerational. In other words, if we were to endow every child, woman, man, I guess boy, girl, Black, white, whatever, with an endowment at birth that allows them to have access to economic security when they become an adult, not only would it help that individual, it would address some of the disparities across gender, race, and society writ large. I'll stop there. Let us reclaim some time if I actually finish in time.
Thank you so much, Darrick. That was great, and very much appreciate not having to tell you to stop. The next person who's going to speak is Corina Rodriguez Enriquez, and she's at the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Public Policy in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And the topic of her presentation is macroeconomic policy challenges to approach inequality in Latin America in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, a feminist perspective. Corina, you're on.
Thanks, Radhika, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with these friends. I wanted to share with you a reflection from a feminist and Latin American perspective, and to locate it in this context of COVID crisis. Because the COVID crisis, I think, has revealed or has exposed many of the issues that we have been highlighting for a long time from feminist perspectives. And I think those are very relevant to think about how we can build better in the future. The first thing that has been made very clear is the interdependence of human lives, that we are all affected by everything and we are very interdependent among each other. It has also been made very clear how some types of work are really essential, and how those essential work are mostly those that are less valued by the market. And of course, here the relevance of care is very explicit. And the other big issue that relates very much with the topic of this panel is that inequality matters. The whole issue of intersectionality that Darrick already told us about, the inequality between people inside the same country, but also inequality between countries. And I think it's important to bring a perspective from the global south to highlight this idea. This context of COVID has shown the different scope for policies responsive to the crisis, depending on the country, and how inequality explains both the impact of the crisis, the different impact of the crisis, as well as the different policy space to react to the crisis, and to move or to think on the recovery from the crisis. And the other issue that we have been talking for long, and I think it has also been made very clear in this context, is that the structural characteristic of financial capitalism remain unchanged, and that it is really very impressive, the mismatch between the real economy and the financial economy. There was no lockdown, no quarantine for the financial system. Financial gains, nothing happened to that. And this is, I think, a very key aspect that we still need to think and discuss about. And in terms of inequality, I think the last very big picture of this is how unequal is the access to the vaccine between countries, and even between people in the same countries. In terms of Latin America and the Caribbean specifically, it has been told in different spaces that Latin America has been the most affected region in the global South, also because it has got into this crisis with an already pretty bad economic performance. And it is estimated that there would be in 2020 an average slowdown of the GDP of 7.5%, and unemployment has growth up to 10%. This is average for the region, and the increase of poverty and an extreme poverty. For example, in the country where I live, Argentina, which is a middle income country in the context of Latin America, 40% of the total population is now living under the poverty line. And in this context, there are many macroeconomic challenges that countries in the region are facing. One of it is the threat of the debt crisis. In order to tackle the consequences of the pandemic, countries have to finance their policy response in different ways. Some of the countries have going to debt processes again, and the threat of a debt crisis is again there. And while many countries have implemented active policy responses, even those that have been very reluctant to a strong state and the state intervening in the economy, many of the countries have implemented active policy responses, have extended cash transfer programs, have supported employment and salary through subsidies. But this is not easy to keep in time, to sustain over time. And now I think we are again facing, in many of the cases, the threat of austerity. So there is a threat of debt, and it is also the threat of austerity. And again, my country is a very good example. Argentina's budget for 2021 is clearly biased to austerity, even when we have now a kind of progressive government. And it is also not easy to sustain a heterodox financing of public policy, which some countries have used to finance the response to the crisis, but then the structural tensions appear, for example, between printing money and inflation. And I think the main macroeconomic challenges that countries in Latin America are facing is the development pattern. The impact of slowdown of international trade, and the fact that Latin America is still relying very much in an extractive development pattern, which means despoilment of natural resources, which means destruction of households' livelihoods, which means criminalization of social resistance. Latin America is the region where the number of human rights defenders that have been killed is the highest in the world. And this development pattern has no positive results in terms of job creation, for example. And in fact, what it means basically is more benefit for transnational corporations that concentrate the export market of the regions. And the other very structural feature that Latin American countries still face, and most of the global south faces, the financial flows, both licit financial flows and illicit financial flows, that remains structural challenges. And I good to add, and it has to do with something that Radhika said before, that on top of all that, there is a weaknesses of democracy. Democracy have been attacked and became weaker with this crisis. So to go to my last point, I think that the big question is who will pay the bill of this crisis, and whether there is any space for a structural transformation, and whether this transformation can be aligned with a feminist agenda. So despite all the above that are basically pretty negative points, I think in Latin America there have been a couple of positive events recently within the crisis. For example, some countries in the region have implemented wealth taxes. It is the case of Bolivia, it is the case of Argentina, even when they are small, very moderate, they are maybe a start, or they are at least something. I think the other positive point in Latin America is the ability we have had, even within the crisis and the lockdown and the quarantine, to keep social resistances alive. It has been the case in Peru that have resisted a kind of a civilian coup. It is the case of Chile, who is now going through a constitutional process to change the constitution. And it is even the case in Argentina, where we have just got the approval of legal abortion as a consequence of years of feminist struggle. So I think the social mobilizing in Latin America is a very good point to take into account, a very good platform from where more structural changes can be pushed. And the other issue that I would highlight as a positive one in Latin America is that the care agenda has been made more visible and urgent than ever. And again, Argentina can be an example, because the country is now starting to build a national care system. And I want here to highlight that many of these advances has to do with feminist colleagues entering into the policy decision-making processes, entering into government positions and having the possibility to push for this agenda. In the case of Argentina, the care agenda is one of the priorities in this sense. However, and I will finish with this, structural issues are still difficult to tackle. Fiscal constraints, economic policy conditionality as a consequence of having to negotiate again with the IMF, challenges to change the development pattern, and most of all, the resistance of the elites, both political and economic elites. So what is needed from my point of view, and this is my last message, I think that in order to push for a structural transformation, we need to push for multilateral cooperation and coordination. It is pretty amazing how, given the global dimension of this crisis, the response to the crisis has not been at all globally articulated. And we need multilateral cooperation and coordination to tackle inequalities in global trade, inequalities in investment, to tackle illicit financial flows, to tackle, challenge, and transform institutions like the investor state development settlements. We need to multilateral cooperation to push for taxation on fintech, on wealth, on the richest people. And for this, I think, together with the multilateral cooperation and coordination, more on an institutional and state level, we need to reinforce the global social resistance. I think global coordination of resistance is also very, very important to push for a new social contract that should be a green social contract and a feminist social contract. And what is specifically, in my point of view, what feminist economics can do on this? I think it is very important to strengthen the dialogue and the networking between the academia and the feminist movements. There have been a consolidation of many platforms during the crisis and as a response to the crisis from the social movements that I think feminist economics should get engaged in. The Confluencia Feminista in a more Latin American area and even with Spain, the Feminist Monitoring and Advocacy Toolkit in the Feminist COVID Response platform, the platform People Over Profit. There are only examples of platforms that get together different social movements where I think feminist economists should get engaged. I think we can contribute by renewing the extensive evidence of the impact of crisis on austerity, on inequalities, on well-being. I think we need to reinforce our proposals and to make them stronger. And I really think we need to get involved in policy making. And just to finalize, I think this recent pass of the legal abortion bill in Argentina is a very good example that when resistance is well-grounded, is creative, is persistent, and is feminist, changes are really possible. Thank you.
Very nice note, something to celebrate. Our next speaker is Jayati Ghosh from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And her topic, I think, feeds right into Corina's call, is Intersecting Inequalities in COVID-19 Responses in Developing Countries. Jayati, you're on.
Thank you so much, Radhika, and it's great to be on this panel, and particularly to follow Corina, because I think I'm really going to repeat a lot of what she has already said. And it's a theme that I think Darrick also picked up about intersectionality. I really want to talk about two kinds of intersectionality here, which are not the ones we usually talk about. We usually talk about, obviously, gender interacting with race, with class, with, in India, caste, and so on. I want to pick up the intersectionalities of location and occupation with gender and say how, and look at how COVID, the entire pandemic response has really reflected these very, very sharp differences by location and by occupation. So the first locational difference is North versus South, if you like. And I think Corina has already identified some of those critical issues. But there are really three ways in which this has been very, very marked in the current, in 2020, shall we say. The first is the fiscal response, which Corina mentioned. We have had in the advanced economies fiscal responses of anywhere between 5 to 25% of GDP. I think the US is somewhere in the middle at about 11, 12%. But across countries that earlier saw public spending as anathema, something that simply couldn't be done, suddenly the money is there. And of course, you know, central banks have been very accommodating, and we have massive fiscal responses. In the developing world, by contrast, even the countries that can afford to do it have actually been very, very reticent. So certainly there are countries that cannot afford to do it, those with debt problems, those who are facing IMF conditionalities, and so on. But there are countries like Mexico and my own country, India, where we have actually seen a decline in public spending, not an increase, a decline in public spending in real terms in this period of the pandemic. So you can imagine, I mean, austerity is not in the future. Austerity has already happened during the pandemic for a very large range of developing countries. And that has huge implications for what people who are located in these countries experience and women in these countries experience in terms of social services, what happens to those, including health services, social protection, whether you get it or not, who's included or excluded, how much you get, employment, what happens to levels of employment, whether you can keep your job, whether you will lose it, what happens to the wages in that work, All of these are hugely affected by that. The second big difference is something that really emerged in the last 1 month, and that's in terms of access to vaccines. We have a multilateral agreement. We have the COVAX facility, which, okay, the US didn't join, but pretty much all the other major countries joined, which was ideally meant to ensure an equitable distribution of vaccines, beginning with 3% of the population in all countries, then to 20%, and then finally rolling out to everyone. And they had a very good, just pattern of distribution envisaged. Having signed up to this, advanced economies then did side deals with the vaccine companies, so that of the 3 vaccines that have been generally now accepted for approval, 80% of the year's output, the annual output of 2021, has already been bagged by countries representing 14% of the world's population. Basically, it means the developing world is not going to get it. And that in turn has huge implications for how long this will persist in the developing world, for what it will mean to women, and whether you're in the north or the south now, it matters hugely, even in terms of whether you can expect a broader economic and social recovery, whether you yourself will be safer from the disease, whether you can expect a return to so-called normal life in the foreseeable future. All of these depend on whether your governments have been able to access these vaccines. Of course, it's a different matter that it turns out, having bagged all the vaccines, governments of the North are incompetent. Certainly the United States, apparently it will take 10 years at the current rate of rollout to actually vaccinate the population. But that incompetence has not stopped them from monopolizing the production of these vaccines. I think that's the second major intersectionality. And the third is something that Corina already referred to, the whole issue of the medium-term recovery. The fact that more and more developing countries face not only debt concerns, but very volatile capital flows, which do not depend on their own conditions or expectations, but really on monetary policy in the North, on therefore the possibilities of recovery and the possibilities of employment generation in the foreseeable future. So those are the North-South divisions, but locations within countries also matter hugely. There's the rural versus urban divide. There were those who felt that, well, rural areas are safer, they're going to be less congested, and they're less likely to be exposed to the disease. It turns out that's not necessarily true. In many developing countries, often very backward areas, have faced extreme expansion or proliferation of the disease. And this is happening certainly in India, but I think it's happening in some Latin American countries also, where it's going to remote areas without adequate medical facilities and devastating them. But within urban areas, whether you live in a slum or you live in a middle class or upper class area, neighborhood, completely defines the degree to which you are exposed, the degree to which you are able to follow those so-called social distancing, actually physical distancing strategies, the degree to which you are able to wash your hands frequently with soap and do all of those kinds of things. All the protective measures are simply not possible for large numbers of people who live in slums in the developing world. Then there are the issues of the states and provincial governments in federal systems. Many countries have got federal systems. And we also know that one of the features of how COVID response has played out is that central governments have established some kinds of control, but they haven't really coordinated across states, and pretty much they have left states or provinces to deal with the problem themselves. And this in turn means that whether in India you're in a particular state or another will hugely affect the conditions you have to face, the social services you will get, the health conditions that will exist, and so on. And I think that's also true of Brazil, possibly true of Argentina, that it's certainly true in the United States as well, that the federal inequalities are playing out within countries. And finally, there's the issue of the digital divide. This pandemic has emphasized and it has accelerated the digitalization of everything, global, economic, social, information, all kinds of processes, in a way that was unimaginable actually even a year ago, because we knew it was coming, but that would come upon countries that are simply unprepared, was unexpected. India, where less than a quarter of the population has even got smartphones or any kind of computer in their home, has gone for digital education. And this is true in many, many countries, that, there's this huge inequality coming out because of the digital divide, which is very marked in many of our countries. Just to turn to the intersectionalities, inequalities of occupation. And I want to highlight some of the areas, I think, again, mentioned by Corina, but let me just talk about it again. Health workers. This was supposed to be the great, they're recognized as essential. Care work is supposed to be seen now as important, essential, necessary for resilience of societies and economies. Hey, it turns out that that doesn't affect their conditions. Across the developing world, and I imagine possibly in some developed countries as well, health workers are facing delayed payments. Many of them are being turned out of jobs and forced to enter into really piece rate sometimes, or very, gig kinds of active work, rather than the regular work in which they had been doing, because, again, municipalities and provinces are being denied resources. We are finding that health workers and care workers in general, who should have been the most rewarded, most remunerated, and most respected out of this pandemic, are actually among the worst off workers. And just as Corina mentioned, bankers seem just fine, thank you very much. Executives in large digital corporations are also just fine, thank you, which are really not in that sense essential workers at all. We find that sanitation workers, again, absolutely essential, not only not given the credit and the remuneration that they are due, but also denied basic protection when they are dealing with the fallout of the pandemic. Whether it is dealing with medical waste or human waste or dead bodies or anything, they are being denied the protection. And this is certainly extreme in India, but I think it's fairly widespread. The poor treatment of essential sanitation and other frontline workers who are absolutely essential in dealing with the impact of the pandemic. Then there are unpaid workers. And of course, we know that women dominate in unpaid work, but it's not only women, certainly women dominate in unpaid work. Unpaid work has gone up hugely in this pandemic, again, because governments have reneged on responsibility to provide a whole lot of the services that are essential. And it's weird because you're getting an increase in time poverty at the same time that you're getting an increase in open unemployment. And I think that's a conundrum that we will have to explore in much more detail over the coming year as well, because I think this particular pattern will continue. There will be increased open unemployment and there will be increased time poverty because of the greater burden of unpaid work. And of course, all of these inequalities do intersect with inequalities of race, gender, class, etc., etc., etc. But I just want to highlight that these are specific aspects of intersectionality that we really need to focus on in this pandemic. So clearly what is required, yes, is, I've been calling it a multicolored global New Deal. It has to be green, it has to be blue because water is a huge issue in most of the developing world. It has to be purple, as you've highlighted, Radhika, in terms of the care economy. It has to be red for reducing inequalities. So we need that multicolored deal, but it has to be global because it cannot be done without major changes in the global international architecture. It has to require much greater tax cooperation. It has to require a big issue of SDRs and liquidity for the developing world. It has to require some debt resolution, and it has to require limiting the power of large corporations, which they currently exert through trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. Okay, let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jayati. And now our last speaker is James Hines from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And the title of his paper is The Triple Threat: Care, Sustainability, and Macroeconomic Crisis. James, you're on.
Great. Thanks a lot, Radhika. And so, sorry. So just a few quick comments about the presentation. It's actually based on a paper written for the special issue of the journal Feminist Economics on the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic crisis. And I think all the articles in that special issue should be available in about a month from now. So it's a good resource for people to look at in terms of some innovative analysis from a feminist perspective of the COVID crisis. My paper was co-authored with Silke Staub and Laura Turquet from the Data and Research Division of UN Women. So just giving credit where credit is due. And I just want to talk about a few points that we raise in this paper. So some of the main points that we bring up is that globalized market-based economies depend on a foundation of non-market goods, services, and productive activities. And these interact with capitalist institutions in complex ways. And I think this is very evident, as other people have already said, with respect to the COVID crisis, in terms of the sudden increase in the demand for unpaid care, childcare, elder care, in healthcare is one illustration. But if we're thinking about climate change and pending environmental disasters, it's also relevant there. And the argument in terms of thinking about macroeconomic policy is that some of the biggest contradictions of our current capitalist systems are not fully contained within the market economy itself, but rather result from the interactions between capitalist processes and non-market spheres of our economies. And the focus of our paper is the care economy in the environment. So that's the triple threat, the combination of a potential crisis of care, environmental crisis, and macroeconomic crises. So a lot of the paper kind of contrasts market and non-market processes in institutions. And the argument is that we can't talk about the kind of market economy as being completely separable from the non-market economy. And even the language we use in economics often creates a separation. So we need to think beyond, for instance, thinking about externalities, where externalities really refer to non-market processes that affect the functioning of markets and somehow distort those markets or lead to market failures. But the non-market processes are external to markets. Well, you know, this way of thinking about non-market processes and their impact on market economies kind of puts the market economy in the center, and everything else is external to this. So why do we do this? I think the current crisis really demands us to rethink how we think about these processes, because markets can affect the functioning of non-market processes in which the sustainability and reproduction of our economies actually depend. So non-market processes, therefore, are not external. They are actually integral to the workings of the economy. And that's a major conceptual framework that we tried to present in this paper. So to think about the implications of this for macroeconomics, kind of the theme of this panel, if macroeconomic crises can arise from the interaction between market and non-market processes, our traditional crisis management strategies aren't going to necessarily be sufficient, such as Keynesian aggregate demand stimulus. It might be necessary, but it does not resolve the contradictions between the market sphere and the non-market sphere by itself, or the large liquidity injections that some economies, central banks have been able to implement to stabilize financial markets also do not necessarily address these core problems in terms of the tension between market and non-market processes. Our standard kind of thinking about macroeconomic crisis, at least from a heterodox perspective, the Keynesian crisis theories, Kaleckian crisis theories, Minsky approach, they're still relevant. It's not to say that they're not relevant, but they're limited. They limit their analysis to crises that are endogenous to market processes alone, but don't really look at the endogeneity of crises that arise in the non-market spheres of our economies. And so concerns around demand for care and more broadly social reproduction and climate change raise important challenges for how we actually go forward and think about macroeconomic crisis theories. So people have talked a whole bunch about different distributive dynamics on this panel. Darrick, Corina, and Jayati, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of location, in terms of North and South. I want to focus on another aspect that I think is relevant when we're thinking about the current crisis and the lessons that we can draw from that, and that's intergenerational intergenerational conflict. And I think it's very evident that we have these types of conflicts and distributive dynamics in the COVID crisis, but people are kind of loath to actually talk about them directly. And so the COVID crisis has really highlighted, in my mind, on some aspects of intergenerational conflict. There's a strong correlation between mortality rates and age, for instance, but the cost of shutdowns and the cost of unemployment are going to differ by the age cohort, just because participation in the market economy and in kind of formal labor markets differ dramatically by age cohorts. But more generally, you know, changes, big demographic changes that we see taking place worldwide. In fact, half the world's population now live in countries with below replacement fertility, and they're experiencing aging populations. Make these issues around distributive conflicts and their relationship to macroeconomic stability even more pronounced, and are important to take into account as we're looking to the future. And I think this is very relevant when we're thinking about these interactions between market and non-market production. So, I mean, it's kind of an obvious, this is data from the US on labor force participation rates in terms of market production. And you can see, I mean, this is no news to anyone, but, you know, labor force participation rates are much lower for the younger generation and for the older generation relative to kind of the middle, what people refer to as the working age population. But you know, these issues in terms of contribution to the market economy are also relevant in terms of thinking about contributions to the unpaid non-market care economy. So this is from the American Time Use Survey, just the amount of time spent in caring for and helping household members. You can see that and this only shows time spent by women because they're performing most of this care anyhow. You can see in terms of the age profile that it's mostly women in their 30s and early 40s that are providing the bulk of the caring labor, while the recipients of those care services tend to be either younger people or older age cohorts. So why is this relevant? Well, Paul Samuelson had some early, very interesting work on overlapping generations, where he was looking at a situation where an older generation stakes a claim on a share of the income or output produced by this working age generation. Their claims that they stake in terms of just consumption or healthcare services are larger than their own productive contributions. So that's where you get some of this intergenerational conflict. So how you address it, if you just have these two generations, kind of a working age generation and an older generation, in Samuelson's paper, he said you can address it by private prior savings using financial instruments and financial markets. You save up while you're working, and then you use those financial assets in order to stake a claim to the production that you need to live after you stop working. Or it could be addressed by a social contract, something like a pay-as-you-go pension system like the US has in terms of Social Security, where the working age population is taxed in order to support the older generation. And then as that working age population ages, the social contract is that the next generation then supports them, and so on and so on. This tends to work best if you have a growing population. When you have below replacement fertility in an aging population, suddenly it's less sustainable to have that type of social contract. So intergenerational conflict is kind of easy to solve when you have, or easier to solve when you have a working age population and an older population. But what happens when you add a third generation, a third dependent generation, children? Because children don't have any prior savings. They don't enter, into the world with prior savings. Children generally cannot negotiate binding agreements with regard to how they will be raised. So there's no market interactions. Children don't enter into a market at a very young age to negotiate for early childhood development, the quality of early childhood development. you're kind of left with social contracts, but they might not always be enforceable, particularly with the types of demographic change. So a very common social contract would be parents invest in their children with the understanding that the children will take care of them as they age. But this arrangement is just not always enforceable. That's the King Lear problem, when your children actually do not necessarily support you as you age. And you don't have the basis for markets being able to solve these types of problems of distributive conflict. And so if we want to even think further about these intergenerational conflicts, it's very clear that this applies to environmental crises as well. It's not simply a younger generation, it's not simply children, but it pertains to generations yet to be born. The consumption decisions of current generations have implications for future generations. And there can be real conflicts there. And you cannot have market-based solutions to try to mediate these types of distributive dynamics, partly because of the externalities associated with environmental issues, but also because we can't negotiate on fair terms with people who do not yet exist. You can't have those agreements. You cannot have fair market transactions across generations. There's no real basis for exchange. So economic theory usually gets around this problem by assuming that the current generation has some degree of altruism towards future generations. So it just assumes that there's a preference out there, or that everyone has identical utility functions and people live over an infinite time horizon. So it's just basically one person maximizing utility that doesn't change over time. But these are really questionable assumptions at best. Because what we care about, the issues that Radhika raised, what we care about, what the economy is actually for, and what is actually valued, does change with time. Our preferences do evolve. They're not stable. They shift in unpredictable ways, and social movements really shape our preferences and what we put forward as being important. Okay, so those are some of the main points raised in the paper. So where do we go from here? Well, some of the key kind of lessons that we raise in the paper are that COVID has shown us that we need a new approach to macroeconomics, that our standard crises theories aren't sufficient to understand the current crisis. And we need an understanding of macroeconomics that incorporates non-market aspects of our global economic system and recognizes all the range of distributive conflicts that we've talked about during this session. Policy issues around care and environmental sustainability are not just derivative issues, they are actually macroeconomic policy issues. They have to be part of the macroeconomic policy discussion. And this trio of interlocking structural crisis in terms of care, the environment, the macroeconomy really reveals some of the shortcomings of our standard economic theories and policy responses, which we desperately need to address now. So I'm gonna end there, so we have lots of time for discussion.
Thank you, James, that was great. I think all the papers really work well together. So we have a few questions that are coming up in Q&A. So I'll read them out. And the first one is from Alyssa Brownstein. She says, thank you for an excellent panel. Jayati and Corina both address policy constraints in the global South. Similar constraints have echoed across prior global crises. To what extent do you see international institutions, IMF, World Bank, UN, WTO, treating this crisis differently than prior ones in terms of creating more policy space, if at all? In other words, is this time different? Do you see any special opportunities? I'm going to read the second question because I think they're connected, so I'll read them both. This is from Erica Allo to Jayati and James. I see an overlapping between two issues you raised: time poverty, unemployment, and unemployment intergenerational distribution. Would you like to expand on that? Thank you. So I'll start with Corina, and then Jayati, and then James.
Thank you, and nice to see Elisa somehow. Well, I really don't think this time is different, and I will make three points on this. The first one is, I think all these global institutions are still very much on the idea that what can overcome the crisis is economic growth, and they do not challenge at all the frame of the financial capitalism. So that is, for me, the first reason to say there is nothing new and this time is not different. My second point could be that what might sound different is their discourse. We have this like pinkwashing of these institutions, and then we have this programs supported by the World Bank that have the gender token or the poor token, but then they are only supporting the usual way of doing things. My third point would be, for example, the World Bank. It's one of the main global institutions pushing for public-private partnerships as a way to even finance the recovery. So I think that is an example on it's not different, it's even worse, or it's more of what we have previous to this. And the last comment would be in my own experience living in Argentina, who is now starting to renegotiate a loan with the IMF, a loan that have been given by the IMF to the previous government, and that basically was used to finance financial flow. There is no, how you say it in English, autocritica. There was no, the IMF didn't recognize they do anything wrong with giving that loan to a government that was only financing capital flow. And even when the current Ministry of Economy in Argentina is the guy who was working with Joseph Stiglitz before becoming the Ministry of Economy in my country, and he has a very good relation with Cristalina and blah, blah, blah. As I said before, the 2021 budget for the central government it's very biased to austerity. So my feeling is that they are already agreeing to some austerity in order to enter in better terms in the negotiation with the IMF. So for all of these reasons, I think there is nothing new, and this time it's not different at all.
Thank you, Corina. And the other thing I just wanted to add to that, calling on myself, is, there's a kind of IMF rhetoric at the global level that pretends that austerity isn't there, and then at the country level is just back to the same old thing. And also the negotiations of the WTO in terms of intellectual property is another one that I think we should keep in mind when we talk about what we can do next. Jayati, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, yeah, Radhika, I want to agree with Corina, and actually to repeat what you just said. If you look at the IMF, there's a huge disconnect between what Kristalina Georgieva is saying in public and what Geeta Gopinath is also saying in public, which is basically you have to spend more, you have to do more social protection, you need more, and this is the time when to increase public spending is what they're saying. If you look at the offices on the ground, you actually find that in Argentina, in Ecuador, in Pakistan, in a whole range of other countries where the IMF is actually negotiating, they're asking for the same old things, the same old austerity and so on. So unfortunately, I mean, I suppose we should welcome the fact that at the top, there is a little bit of a change in stance, but then we should say, for one thing, ensure that change in stance translates into your desk operations and what you're doing in the ground in different countries, and also get rid of the double standards. We saw this after the global financial crisis. Fine for the advanced economies to spend more. Developing countries, no, you cannot spend more. So I think that's the first. You mentioned WTO. I mean, it's, when people say imperialism is dead or colonialism is an outdated word, and so all you have to do is to look at the vaccines as a classic example. India, South Africa, and 6 other countries have brought a case in the WTO saying during the pandemic, suspend the IPRs for all COVID-related activities. In other words, effectively issue a compulsory license for all of these. which is there in the TRIPS agreement. And it's not saying that these companies will get nothing, but that they will get a reasonable fair return. They will not be allowed to charge what they like. They will not be allowed to restrict production. Other companies, other producers will have access to this technology, whether it is treatment or drugs. It's such a reasonable demand, and yet it was immediately blocked by the US, the European Union countries, Switzerland, the usual suspects. It has been blocked 8 times in the WTO. So unfortunately, nothing's changed. Why? Because global power imbalances haven't changed. And if anything, they have got extended over this period. On the other issue of unemployment, time poverty, and unemployment intergenerational distribution, I think that's a very good and interesting point. And I think the lesson I would draw from this is exactly what Jane said, that there's this impossibility of market-based solutions in this context. But I would go further. I would say that it's not just that there's an impossibility, that the reliance on markets at all is making things much worse. It's actually causing further deterioration of this and creating, I would argue, not just unsustainable, but unviable social and economic relations. So that we thought we were stuck with the dead shroud of capitalism. We've now got a dead shroud of capitalism that is, leaking poison into societies and creating completely unworkable societies. So obviously, what does that mean? It means you have to actually come out there and do all the New Deal stuff of more public spending, regulations of all markets, capital markets, financial markets, labor markets, environment. You have to regulate and you have to actually redistribute. Those were the elements of the New Deal. I mean, I think you have to do that, not just to save capitalism from itself, to save humanity from this gargantuan monster, which is actually otherwise heading for a kind of broader destruction. Yeah.
Very true. And just to add, Jayati, it's also using the kind of New Deal policies during a shutdown when you're not consuming. It's also a problem, right? So you're using what we know, but this is so different. So how do we rethink those possibilities? James, do you want to answer Erica's question?
I mean, in terms of the kind of the apparent paradox of unemployment going up and time poverty also going up at the same time. It's only a paradox if you only focus on the market economy and you ignore the non-market economy. If you look at them together, it's no longer paradoxical at all. What we see is a shift from market activities into non-market activities, from to essential non-market activities. And so, it raises a question: did unemployment really go up if we count on non-market activities as a type of employment? A lot of people I talk to say that they've never been busier during this COVID crisis, in terms of just the demands on their time. If we think about the implications this has for macroeconomics, we have to kind of redefine some of our core macroeconomic policy goals, such as full employment. What does full employment actually really mean these days? If we combine the non-market and the market economy. I do think there's a really interesting set of issues around access to money income at this time. That it's been tied to labor markets, to kind of standard paid labor markets. And we see some of the policy responses that many countries have implemented, introducing kind of some type of basic income grant that separates access to money income from participation in the paid labor market, or at least that it has the potential to do that. So I think that we see a lot of those type of initiatives. I don't think that they're sufficient by themselves to solve all the crises, as I said, of the care crises, some of the environmental crises. But that type of delinking, I think, is a very interesting development that's happened in a number of places that we should really look at in terms of really thinking about this idea of a universal basic income, what it brings to the table, and what is still needed in addition to that.
I saw your hand, Jayati. Just one sec. I'm going to go to Darrick first. Darrick, I mean, the last few papers have been sort of the North-South divide, but I wanted to see whether you wanted to address the North-South divide inside the North, as we see it functioning in the US, and some of that, and then I'll get back to you, Jayati.
Well, I'll start with the North-South divide and then link it to what's going on inside the North in terms of stratification. To begin with, and it's related to the presentation, how we measure value is indicative in our reactions to this crisis. If we focus on GDP per capita, we focus on growth. If we focus on measuring value vested in individual self-interest, then we will have limited policy approaches. And then we might come up with notions of conflict between generations. But if we take a more holistic, humanistic, moral interpretation of value, which is not foreign. I mean, we have periods in economic history in which we have measured value beyond just those measures. The Marshall Plan becomes one such indicator and one such policy in which we intervened to promote peace with foreign policy in a way to develop Europe at the end of World War II to avoid World War III. And it was grossly successful, although limited to European countries, which are white. So it was both the elements of racism in its application, including its design. The second point I'll try to make is our industrial policy and trade policy is too firm-centric. We separate labor policy from industrial policy and trade policy, and labor is an afterthought. If labor were put up front and if people were put up front, then perhaps the ways in which our international organizations, which I guess coordinate and help to coordinate industrial and trade policy, would perhaps come up with alternatives and better measures. And then I'll end again on the Marshall Plan. I think if we had a global Marshall Plan in general that was aimed at promoting the well-being of nations, that it would not only benefit those nations, but also come back to what you asked me in the beginning, Radhika, which is how does this impact the North in a stratification frame? If we had a Marshall Plan and a trade policy that was labor focused, it would impact the United States with regards to immigration. It would impact the United States with regards to if we had policies that promoted fairer labor standards, for example, that promoted government intervention so as to promote human capabilities, then our firms in the US would be able to compete on fairer terms with labor in the US. If we, for example, also had universal health care in the United States, that would make us more competitive. And now I'm on a tangent in an international frame as well. But the bottom line that I'm trying to make is that we need to redefine how we measure value, and we need a labor and human focus in both our trade and industrial policy.
Thank you, Darrick. Jayati, you wanted to go next.
Yeah, actually, just a footnote to what both James and Darrick just said. I mean, really, this is all about the distinction between work and employment, which is something that the ILO finally accepted in 2013, but feminists have been saying it forever, right? For decades, we have been saying there's a very big distinction between work and employment. We do not value work, we value employment. And that's part of all, the other mistakes in terms of valuation that we make as societies and economies. But once you recognize that, then in fact, the need to generate employment out of what is currently work becomes very significant, and there you cannot do it without the public. So yes, non-market, but let's not value non-market too much, because the burden of the non-market is borne by, let's face it, patriarchal and other kinds of processes that occur within our societies. The not just patriarchal, but also other forms of social differentiation. So let us push for public recognition of work and enable much more of this unpaid work to be not just recognized, but redistributed and respected. Yeah.
Just a quick response, the public sector can be a non-market, is largely a non-market.
Oh yeah, sure. I recognize that. But what I'm saying is let's not, say, oh, here's this lovely non-market, because the fact that it's a cushion and a shock absorber is a bad thing. Yeah.
I mean, I'd have to say that some of the feminist critique of the kind of buen vivir movement from the feminists is some of that, right? That it's not that going to anti-colonial, anti-capitalist stance necessarily means it's good for women. And so how do we do that?
There's one wonderful thing in the Ecuador plan, which I've always really appreciated, which is that one of the goals was to increase relational time. Time to have social relations.
Yeah, I think the whole time poverty work is really a good fit with that, which is something I'd mentioned. So we still have a lot of time, and so I was going to ask each of you. I mean, this is a panel on sort of a large structural issues of macroeconomic policy and other such issues. And Corina, you really did a call to all of us to say, how do we engage with social movements? Because if there was ever a time, at least in my lifetime, that we needed a combined effort of both academics and activists and a real rethink about how, I mean, as I'd said, what our economy is for. And so given all the work that all of you have done, I wondered if each of you could take a couple minutes and say, okay, if we were able to think forward and say, what is it that we want? What's the kind of worldview that we want? I mean, not the nitty gritty of it, but if you could just spell out the kind of issues we need to focus on and what kind of mobilization we should do. And especially as the International Association for Feminist Economics, our panel, what is it that we can do to contribute to this needed conversation? And Corina, I'm going to start with you because you made the call to us. So I'm sure you've thought about it. So I'll start with you and then I'll have all of you go along.
Thanks, Radhika. I think that some of the things that we need to do are the ones that I mentioned before, in terms of one, to reinforce and to strengthen the dialogue, the networking between academia and social movements and policymaking. And I think that something that we can already find at IAFE is that many of us have these different umbrella hats, or that we are at the academia, but we are also part of civil society organization, and at some point in our life, we may even engage in policy making. And I think that is what we need. And we need to continue challenging the academia. We still need to push for feminist economics to mainstream, to spread around. And I think that we can contribute with our research to support activism, because many times social movements are very clear in the messages, but then the evidence they have to prove that what they are saying is the real thing is weak. So I think we need to use all the knowledge we have and the ability we have to produce relevant evidence to link with the social movements and make their messages and their activism stronger. And definitely, I think we need to get involved in policy making, and we need to because if I think in Latin America, and if I think especially on care issues, the places where there have been more advances were the places where this conversation between policy making sphere and social movements and academia was more fluid, and where at some stage feminists were there making policy. So I think that that's something that we really need to put our body there.
I couldn't agree with you more. I was recently told by my university that all the work that you do on public policy does not count. It's only refereed journal articles that count. So nothing else counts. James, you want to go next? Actually, you know what? I'm gonna add one more question that Alyssa has asked, because I think it works with the conversation we're having. She asked, to what extent do you think the economics profession, especially macro types, is receptive to the theoretical points and critiques on how we think about macro that you've all made? So I'm adding that to the conversation. James, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay, in terms of the social movement issue, I have to kind of confess that, you know, when COVID started, I thought this was going to be the death of social movements, because we're all going to be isolated, we're all going to be quarantined, that the social movements were going to really face huge challenges. I do think they face huge challenges, but I also think we have a number of like amazing examples over the past year of great social movements, whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter in the US, or that amazing just organizational effort that, as Corina said, that reversed a civilian coup in Peru in a matter of days, is just kind of amazing. So I'm far less cynical about the end of social movements. I think they are very vibrant, and there's real struggles going on. I think, you know, since this panel has a focus on macro policies, I do think there are big macro constraints, as everyone's talked about, towards the realization of the goals of these social movements. And, you know, one huge struggle is to actually try to shift macroeconomic policy so it creates the type of enabling environment that allows these social movements to actually achieve some of their objectives. You know, just all the austerity policies that are currently being implemented and are being planned are going to squash a lot of kind of the very innovative social policies if we somehow don't address the struggle at that level. I mean, two issues that have already been mentioned, but I think are really important. Corina has very rightly said that financial markets have not been affected by this crisis hardly at all. It's kind of amazing. They're actually doing really, really well in many respects, completely divorced from the real economy. But, you know, the debates around SDRs and everything, it's the financial interests that are really, really kind of pushing some of the constraints. I think there needs to be a huge pushback at this stage. You know, 2008, when everyone was bailed out with no conditionalities on the financial markets, just made them stronger and just have such a kind of, have to say it, kind of a fuck you attitude towards, you know, the rest of the world, and we really need to push back. I also think that our macroeconomic, I mean, I keep saying this, but our macroeconomic concepts and, you know, the aggregates like GDP, I mean, we don't have to throw away GDP, or we don't have to throw away the idea of full employment, but we really need to expand beyond these really old concepts, because I think they're actually becoming a constraint on policy formulation. What policies count as macroeconomic policies? What policies are just derivative? If once you secure good growth, then you can have a healthcare policy, as opposed to seeing health as an investment into the economy. We really have to kind of reimagine how we talk about macroeconomic policy. And in response to Alyssa's question, you know, you feminist economists have been saying these points for ages. They're eventually, you know, they get a little bit of traction, and then, you know, Christine Lagarde or the IMF suddenly says, "Oh, we discovered that gender is important, or these non-market issues are important." I still think we have a long way to go, and there's been some openings in the past maybe 5 years or so, but they're not huge, and there still needs to be a lot of work.
Thank you. Jayati?
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, yeah, these are fascinating questions, but thank you, Alyssa. I wish we could see you on the screen as well. So on the social movements, right now in India, there are about 2 million farmers at the gates of Delhi. In the cold, it's raining, it's freezing. They are outside, young, old, with children, with women farmers. I mean, and they have been out there for a month now, demanding a repeal of farm laws, which would essentially bring in a predatory commercialization of agriculture by large corporations. And they know exactly what this is about. They have understood these laws much better than, you know, the despite all the sophistry that tries to sort of pretend it indifferent. So we have a huge movement, which has completely defied all, the COVID restrictions, etc. And the government, so far, all it's trying to do is ignore. It began by trying to tar, but it's only trying to ignore. But it really means social movements cannot die in that sense. And right now, we're seeing in the worst possible conditions, when there is a spread of disease, when it's freezing outside, when there is absolutely, no media support or anything like that, you still have 2 million farmers and growing at the moment right now in Delhi. In terms of the economics profession, I'm a little cynical about this. Let me be honest. The economics establishment responds to power. Yeah, of course, and a lot of it is economic power, corporate power, lobbies, and of course, who happens to be in state power. And I don't think we should kid ourselves too much about what determines change there. So therefore, yes, I agree with you, Corina. Definitely, we must engage in policy making. And whenever I've had the chance, I've certainly tried to myself and so on. But the focus of our energies has got to be, I think, popular mobilization by bringing information and analysis to the people. I mean, I happen to be right now in the US. I am amazed at the discourse on television and with ordinary people. Nobody seems aware of how the intellectual property rights operate against them. Not just people in developing countries. This is raising the cost of vaccines. This is reducing the possibility of people being vaccinated or even treated in a fair and equitable way, etc. But there's no awareness of it. There's absolutely no knowledge of how these are companies that develop these drugs with entirely public money. In the case of AstraZeneca, fully covered. In the case of Moderna, fully covered. In the case of Pfizer, 80% covered, and the rest of it they've already recouped with their sales in the first 1 month. So this is public money that has been spent, yet you're allowing them to continue to make super profits. There's no public outcry, there's no public discussion, nobody even knows about it. That's our job, to bring this kind of information to the public domain and create a discussion. Nobody thinks about, I mean, the wealth tax thing has then been created as a polarization. Multinationals, Amazon, etc., getting away with zero taxation because of the loopholes in the regulation, which are so easily fixed, and for which there is analysis and suggestions and proposals on how to fix it. It's really low-hanging fruit, but it's not part of the public discourse because we haven't done enough, I believe, to put it out there in a very, very big and systematic way. So I think ultimately, economics profession will change when power balances change, and that will change when enough people demand it, and that's where our role comes in, I think.
I completely agree with you, Jayati. We need to really get the things that we think about and talk about out into the public domain. But sadly, in the US, they're owned by corporations that won't necessarily give us that space to do it. So we do it in smaller places, and we have to amplify it. Darrick?
Well, first, let me say it is an honor and privilege to have served on this panel, and I agree with a lot of the sentiment of my colleagues. I think we need to all begin with values and norms when we conduct our research. I think the notion that anything we do is strictly positivist is part of the problem. I think that the notion that economics is positivist has intentionally given cover to the neoliberal movement, as if what we define as market ideology is fact that goes unchallenged in science. That is part of a rhetoric that is problematic. And in jumping into the conversation you two were just having, the power that we have as people, the power that we have are social movements. I'll give a slight correction to Jim and say that Black Lives Matter was a global movement, and that is the pushback. That is where we could win. But our profession is in the way. Our profession has been in the way by providing that cover. Again, by starting with the notion that what we do is strictly science and not grounded in some ideology or values by which we start. So I would encourage all of us to lead with those values. I'll say a couple other things. Neoliberalism itself is a movement. It is a movement that is laced with narratives, with norms, and we need to combat that. We need to provide viable alternatives. And in terms of worldview, where I would like to go, I don't have a good spiffy definition to define it, but it's pretty much economic rights. It's pretty much a system that recognizes human rights go beyond civil rights and political rights, but a base level of economic rights that people need in their lives if they want to be able to thrive and flourish. It's a recognition that the sorting, the sorting, the rationing that come about from using prices and profit motives for something like healthcare, a job, basic income, food, shelter, that we have a responsibility to provide people with that as a right. If you want to have a market economy after that, so be it. If you want to have a socialist economy after that, so be it. But we need to establish basic rights that are not sorted by anything other than you being a human being. That's the worldview I'd like to have. Let me see anything else real quick before I stop. Here's the last part I'll say. The ways in which neoliberalism has been able to flourish in this notion that, first off, markets are political constructions. When we define a market, it's defined by some political idea, some political construction. It's a recognition that we have a political economy that includes attributes of capital, economics, and attributes of politics. And that right now we have it set up that the elite is able to consolidate their economic and political power at the top. But they're not able to do so without some dominant political group to go along with that system. In the United States case, we see Donald Trump was able to garner 70 million votes. Even though Biden won, he was able to garner 70 million votes by basically running on division, by basically exploiting the fact of white privilege, American privilege, if we want to think about immigration context, by basically saying, however unequal we may be, at least you're not them. So it's a recognition that we need to think about politics, economic, as well as group-based stratification when we're able to combat this system that's able to exist with concentration at the top. It's a whole political economy. So if we're ever going to avoid a despotic leader like Donald Trump again, we need viable policy alternatives that ensure that everybody has some level of economic conditioning, base level, so that they can flourish. Otherwise, the appeal to that divisive, despotic, horizontal equity will always be there.
Darrick, the one thing I wanted to add to what you just said, Darrick, is that, going back to Alyssa's questions about the economics profession, I went to graduate school in the 1980s, and I remember very clearly how heterodox thinking was really just wiped out of most schools that's taught economics. I mean, we have a few exceptions in this panel, but the teaching of economics is so narrow, and what most students study, and most of us feminist economists are not, except with a few exceptions, are not in economics departments, right? So we're not shaping that thinking. So I think it's also, to answer Alyssa, it's like we need to really change economics and do it publicly, so that, as Jayati said, we need to have our ideas out there, so that when they think of economists, they don't think of this group of people. They usually think of a bunch of, white guys talking about about markets. And so I think we need to enter that conversation in a very vocal way. There are no more questions, so I'm asking the audience if there's anyone who has another question that you want to ask, and then I'm going to basically give everyone a minute to wrap up. We're going to wrap up a little early, but I think that's okay. If there's anybody who has a question, you have to ask it now. I guess I'll give it a second. Okay, no more questions. So what I would like to do is just to give each of you a minute to your last thoughts, and also one thing this just came to the top of my head, is that we need to have these kind of conversations. And I think we need to have these conversations to explore new ideas, not only present what ideas we have. You know, it's because often in the academy, it's like, you know something and you tell people, but I think more and more we need to have places where we can all come together, maybe after the vaccines are available in some places, to really just sit and think about what kind of world do we want and how do we get it and how do we do it very concretely with good thinking that goes forward. So I am looking at my screen and seeing who I'm gonna have. Jayati, I'll start with you.
Muted.
You're muted.
Still muted.
You're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. 1 minute quick response. I think there are signs of hope in the profession. I think there are a lot of young people. I'm really actually very impressed with a bunch of different new initiatives. I was just attending a session of this diversifying and decolonizing economics at this conference, where there are a bunch of young people who are really trying to change everything. I think the Young Scholars Initiative is a very good one, which is also now, it's got thousands and thousands of people all across the globe, which is enabled by the Zoom. So I think there are really signs of hope in the profession. It is also true that this is a generation that has been effectively de-skilled because they haven't been exposed to any heterodox thinking in their teaching, but they are aware of that. And that's a huge bonus already. So I think you see that there's a public hunger for these things. Look at the success Mariana Mazzucato is having by saying sensible things. I mean, you know, thank God there is somebody out there who's able to put it in very clear terms that are intelligible to the public, and it's finding resonance. And so I think there are signs of hope. I think we have to be a little more positive, more confident. And let's face it, people like us, we can afford to do it. The young are taking many more risks. Young people in the profession have much more to lose. We really have nothing to lose. We should just be going all out there. Yeah.
I totally agree with you, Jayati. And yeah, Marina now at the consulting with the WHO, I mean, that work is so great and very sensible thinking.
I'm very proud to be on that council for economic health for all. Yes.
Oh, good for you. See, you are in great places to influence policy. I will go next to James.
Oh, I just thought this was a great panel that raised a whole bunch of very relevant issues, and it kind of all meshed together without any prior planning or anything like that. I mean, in terms of this last issue, I've always thought of economics and the economic profession as just another site of struggle, and it's one that I'm engaged with, you know, and I think we're all engaged with that particular struggle. That said, I don't think we can do it alone. We have to have these connections with the social movements, with other disciplines, you know, and other struggles out there. I do think ours is important, and it's important for us to keep going because there is, as Jayati had said, it's such a strong representation. Economic thinking is such a representation of the current structures of power in our societies right now, that if we want to kind of tackle and transform those structures of power, we have to engage in a debate in economics, and not in a debate, a struggle in the economics profession, and economic thinking as well. You're muted.
Yeah, Darrick, you're next, and then Corina, you'll end our.
Yeah, not much more to add. Again, gratitude for being on the stage with all of y'all. Sincere gratitude. I'll say that the neoliberal narrative is a powerful narrative. I mean, its simplicity, its focus on individual agency, hard work. I mean, these are all the themes that people would want to hear, that they're not a victim, that they can make change in their lives. But you know, authentic agency is grounded in resource. It's grounded in resource and the political codification that resource won't be exploited or extrapolated. That's where I think we need to begin, beyond our two welfare theorems of economics.
Corina?
Thanks. I just want to agree with all your last words. I also think that there is hope in the profession, that the new generations are really pushing for changes, that feminist economics is spreading, beyond the limits. And I personally very happy that this has been a IAFE panel. And I think that we always need to keep pushing for IAFE to be radical, to be political. And I think IAFE is a good space where we can get together. And I very much agree with what Radhika said at the beginning of this last round, that we need to come together to ask questions to ourselves, not to bring the answers. I think that's something very feminist, that we believe that creating new questions is as relevant as producing answers. And I think that something that was good in the pandemic was to be able to get together, even like this, no, these little boxes, but we have been keeping collective thinking alive. So I think we should push for that. And because I live in Argentina and we have just have this legal abortion victory, I'm in a very optimistic mood, and I think changes will come soon.
Thank you very much. Thank each of you for a great presentation. I have to say, when I was asked to put this panel together, this was my perfect panel. You all said yes, and it was great. It was really wonderful to have this conversation. And Jayati, I'm so happy you brought up all the young people, and especially as IAFE. I mean, one of the things that we're really focused on is how to be there for this new generation and help them succeed. So on that one, I will conclude our session. We're a little bit early, but I think it'll be fine. And thank you, each of you again, for taking the time to be a part of this great panel. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.